like the light jazz playing in the background. Sets a nice scene here. So, good afternoon and welcome to Dialogue Vanderbilt. My name is Yolanda Pierce and I am honored to serve as the Dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School. This is the third in a series of conversations about religion and public life. You can access our previous conversations with Rabbi David Wolpe and Ms. Maha El-Junaidi on the Vanderbilt Dialogue website. In just a few moments, we'll welcome our guests for today. But first, I would like to speak to us for a few moments, our Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Dr. Sibel Raver.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Dean Pierce, for hosting this series. It's such an incredibly important and timely series. Tonight's event is part of Dialogue Vanderbilt, the initiative, as you all know, that we launched last fall. And as Vanderbilt's Chief Academic Officer, as your Provost, I love Dialogue Vanderbilt because it highlights one of our highest priorities, that of discovery. This series highlights the power of critical inquiry, specifically of breaking open new ways of understanding key issues or challenges that we face, whether in our own lives, our communities, or in the world. Second, I really love Dialogue Vanderbilt because it's so focused on timeliness, on what we need to know right now. We face a time of increasing polarization and political turmoil in this nation and on our university campuses. With that polarization, we are also facing rising threats to free speech and civil discourse on many college campuses. I'm resolute in my commitment as your Chief Academic Officer to protect your freedom to pursue new ideas, new ways of knowing, and new interpretations, whether it be interpreting a biblical text or a federal law or a corpus of data. Both as a scientist and as your provost, I'm clear on how important it is that we're able to engage in discourse and debate where we are collectively refusing to be told what to think or how to think. Third, I love this series for the way that it builds our skill sets. We shape and sharpen our intellectual tools for inquiry when we engage in and when we host really innovative new thinkers such as Don Abram. This series brings important and very different voices to campus to shine a bright light on new ways that we can communicate and collaborate across intellectual difference. As our chancellor has said, as many of you have heard him say, a college campus might be the last best place where our students can learn to converse, collaborate, and at the very least respectfully coexist with people who see the world differently. At Vanderbilt, we are committed to protecting this vital function in service to society. Tonight, we continue a tradition that dates back to at least the 1960s, based on then-Chancellor Alexander Hurd's belief that open forums like this one and the dialogue that they prompt are crucial for transformative education, path-breaking research, and navigating our collective lives as citizens of a shared community. That brings me to being able to speak a little bit about our guest tonight. We're deeply honored to have Don Abram here, the founder of Pride in the Pews, and his leadership exemplifies these key points of importance, timeliness, and strengthening our skill set. As you'll hear from Abram, his work is important and it is deeply timely. It was the first time in the last few years as an undergraduate at Pomona College and then very recently as a master's student in Divinity from Harvard that Don took up the incredibly important challenge to address questions of liberation and freedom from oppression, not only in secular life, but in faith community. Perhaps most importantly, Abram sharpened and honed his own skill set in critical inquiry and challenges and offers new paths for us to challenge ours and strengthen ours in the ways that faith traditions can marginalize and exclude those of us who are members of the LGBTQ+ community. He now builds our skill set to have those deeply important conversations about faith, liberation, and belonging at a national level. He offers one of the most compelling recent examples of debate and dissent, and importantly, he demonstrates the courage that it requires to lean in to simultaneously embracing and changing the organizations and communities with whom we disagree. I hope you find tonight's conversation enlightening. I know that I will. Thank you.
Welcome to Vanderbilt. I am so happy that you are here. Thank you, Provost, for that wonderful introduction. So, I have been hosting these conversations, and the very first thing I've asked our previous guests is the question I'd like to pose to you. And it is the question of why religion? So, in a world in which religion seems like it can be so divisive around so many different issues, in which we probably have more questions than answers, in which we are struggling sometimes to even name certain things, why are you still committed to talking about faith, working with faith communities, doing religion in public life? Why is religion still important to you?
Well, first and foremost, let me express my sincere delight and appreciation to both you, Dean Pierce, Provost, and so many others who made this initiative happen. And for me, religion is critically important to express my spiritual inheritance. I see religion as a form of inheritance. My queer and trans ancestors gathered in what scholars call the invisible institution, where they gathered around their faith convictions to bridle hope, to foster community, to challenge systems of oppression. That signals to me that there is something precious there. There's something sacred there. There are ways in which we can make meaning in the language of faith that allows us to live more full and free lives. And so for me, faith is indispensable to the way that I understand and see myself. It is also the place that I received my own sort of training around how to connect with the divine and with self. And so for me, it's home. It's the place from which everything begins. And if I engage a conversation without faith, I'm not engaging in the fullness of who I am.
I love that you talk about this fullness, right? And the engagement of the full person, the full self. So you are not only the product of a family that was religious, but you made the decision at some point to actually formally study the religion at the graduate level. And tell me about the you before you entered into graduate school to study religion, and the you that was on the other side, having devoted 3 years to the formalized study of religion at the graduate level.
Well, first, how much time do you have?
No, I'll watch the clock.
Well, I think it's important to note my own individual journey here. So I grew up in a hand-clapping, toe-tapping black church on the south side of Chicago. My Jamaican patois-speaking grandmother would drag me to church every Sunday. And Dean Pierce, I would come up with all sorts of reasons as to why I couldn't make it on Sunday morning. I couldn't find the right socks or the right tie. None of that worked. It was all to no avail, and my grandmother would drag me anyway. And I became engaged in all sorts of ministries in the church. I was an usher. I was a junior deacon. I played the bass guitar for 8 years. Don't ask me to play now.
Wow, we're learning the secrets, okay.
All right, and at the age of 14, I was called to preach. And that fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. I was called into a sort of sacredness and a sacred tradition of folk who recognize that they are being called to preach and teach the gospel. And I began traveling across the country, teaching and preaching. And in so doing, I was raising my stature in the black church. I was heading to be the senior pastor of a historic black church. But all of that came to a sudden and crashing halt as I began to explore my sexuality. What I knew instinctively, Dean Pierce, was that I could not embody the truth of my queerness and my calling at the same time. And it's because I knew that if I did, I would not only lose my community, but I would lose the thing I was taught to care most about, and that was my ministry. And so I was closeted for many years as I was preaching and teaching traveling across the country as this young teenager on fire for God, I didn't think that I had the power to question. I didn't think that I had the power to critique certain theological interpretations. And so I simply conformed. It was a pretty uncomfortable process. It was at times a violent process. I policed myself, and I didn't live into the fullness of what I knew to be true. And it wasn't until I arrived at Harvard Divinity School where I was able to unpack what I call toxic theologies. These are theologies rooted in the dehumanization of those whom we see as other. Right, that I was able to reconstruct a theology that allowed me, that gave me permission to take ownership of my faith in ways that honored the fullness of who I was. And so for me, I think if I was thinking about the pre and post Don as it relates to theological education, I would say pre-Don was pretty disempowered. I didn't feel as though I could actually claim my faith as my own. Post-Divinity School, I reclaimed my spiritual authority and my rightful spiritual inheritance.
Thank you. You used the word reconstruct, right? So we often talk about deconstructing, and in religious terms, deconstructing the faith or deconstructing religion, in which we have to dismantle sometimes powers and forces and systems that are not life-giving. I'm interested in that reconstruction part, right? Because I don't often hear about that. So as you attempted to reconstruct your faith, what have been the guiding principles and values that undergird your current work and that reconstruction, that rebuilding process?
This question is really exciting for me because it's in the reconstruction process that I realized by taking a look at Black church history that the Black church has always been queer. And here I am embodying queerness. And I love bell hooks. I always talk about it as a theology according to bell hooks because I think she's really phenomenal. But she talks about queerness as being at odds with the world around you. And I think that's a really powerful frame because in essence, that's what the Black church is. It is at odds with the world around it. It has always been the case. When my ancestors gathered in the hush harbors of plantations, when they decided to sing songs and canisters to lower their voices, they were yearning after an alternative way of thinking, a way of moving through the world that acknowledged their humanity as sacred. And for me, it was in the re-examination of Black church history that I reclaimed its queerness. And for me, so often it feels as if the legacy and history of the church is not given its just due. There were so many figures I did not have the luxury of being introduced to in my early life. Figures like Pauli Murray, a non-binary Black lawyer who laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement, women's rights. I wasn't able to be introduced to Bayard Rustin, the architect of the March on Washington, someone who worked closely with Dr. King and Black church leaders. I didn't know the name Andre Leon Talley, the first Black creative director at Vogue, who also was a Christian and lived his truth. All of these folk contributed to the Black religious tradition and showed me that queerness had always existed, but it existed on the margins. And so that reconstruction process began with the re-examination of Black church history, Black religiosity in the U.S. And in so doing, I realized that we've always been fighting systems of oppression. We've always challenged injustices and done so with a fierceness, with a spiritual conviction that says our faith calls us to create more just and inclusive worlds. And so that reconstruction process began with a re-examination of Black church history, recognizing that we should read it as queer because it has always been queer.
So name the forces, name those systems that attempted to either silence or erase that history, right? Because part of what we've been trying to do with Dialogue Vanderbilt is to actually to call those things out so that as we're having conversations about whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-Islamophobia or what have you, that we actually name it as such, and that we begin to define those terms so that together we have some kind of working definition so that we can be in honest conversation with one another. And so I'd love for you to be able to name some of those terms, some of those ways that the silence happened, the removal from history happened, the removing literally from, I'm thinking about all of those kind of portraits. You walk into a historical building and usually there are these oil portraits of former pastors, or you're at a college, the former presidents or chancellors or something like that. And in a certain sense, what you're describing is the removal of faces that needed to be on the wall. Talk to us about why that happens.
And so for me, one of the things that I like to name is that homophobia and transphobia is a byproduct of slaveholding Christianity, right? Of white colonial Christianity, which suggests that Black life and Black humanity is disposable. That's where we have to begin this conversation. That those who have skin kissed by the sun are somehow less valuable, right, than others. But it isn't just about race. There is a sort of idealized archetype of humanity that has been elevated in ways that render those who fall outside of that archetype as being less valuable, less important, whose stories aren't as sacred. And so for me, as I think about those forces, it's white colonial Christianity, slave-holding Christianity, which is fundamentally rooted in the dehumanization of all Black people, but not just Black people, women, and differently abled folks, and folk who may not simply sort of live or move through the world in the same way as you, and those who we don't see as normative, right, as normative. And so for me, even as I think about the ways in which the Black church has subscribed to homophobia and transphobia, I like to remind the folk I'm in conversation with that this is not ours. This is not our legacy. We have grounded our faith traditions in the fearless pursuit of liberation. And so as I think about this work and the ways in which we make meaning of a tradition that was born out of liberation, that's what comes to mind for me. And I'll also name this for what it's worth. I think that particularly for Black folk, there is a pressure to subscribe to whiteness, right? And not as a person, right? Not to sort of become white, right? But to subscribe to ideals and ideas rooted in oppressive tendencies. And it's not really about race. Right? It's not really about one sort of genealogical lineage. It's about the sort of pursuit of power, right? And that pursuit of power lends us to police ourselves and even the communities that we are a part of, so that we might be more palatable or malleable in the eyes of whiteness. And so for me, I think that for the Black church, when we began to sort of siphon off what is authentic to us, what is true to us, the way we relate, the way we sing, the way we preach, the way that we teach, when we try to make that otherwise, when we try to distort that in service of being accepted by mainstream society, it will lend us to actually dispose of our own people. Right? Because they are a risk to us being seen as acceptable and or palatable. And so there becomes, you start to see this corrosive force, right, rooted in aspirations of whiteness that silences the lived experiences of folk like me, but also of so many other systems of oppression like patriarchy and sexism, which are all interconnected, right, in service of being more acceptable in the eyes of those who have traditionally been in power. And so those forces, for me, ultimately, I think its origins are rooted in sort of slaveholding Christianity, sort of ridding ourselves of our customs and our traditions and ways of being in service of escaping punishment, in service of being safe. Because if I rid myself and make myself legible in the eyes of those in power, then I am safer. Right? And so for me, I think those are the origins of homophobia and transphobia, and it is really existing alongside a whole host of other systems of oppression that silence those who are seen as other.
You come from a tradition where the text, and I just said the text, and even just saying the text, right? Recalls something, right? So the sacred scripture of the Christian tradition, the Holy Bible, has a theological weight to it. The text is evoked in every setting imaginable. The text is understood as essentially a guidebook, right, for how one should live one's life. What do you do with the text that would deny your full flourishing? What do you do with the text with which we've grappled for centuries? So our generation won't be the first, nor will we be the last. We will grapple with, and these are texts about sexuality. These are texts also about race. These are texts, as you mentioned, about gender and patriarchy and what have you. But they are there, and they are present. And for people who ascribe a deep significance and theological value to these words, that these words are sacred, how do you reconcile, how do you do the exegetical work so that the text for you, as someone who is an ordained minister, still has value, but you deal with the reality of what the text may in fact be saying as others are reading it and interpreting it?
So I want to answer this question by sharing a little bit about the work of Pride in the Pews and how we began. We began with a storytelling project called Can I Get a Witness? And for those of you who may know the Black church, when a preacher has done their good studying, I mean, they're getting ready to tell you a point that is profound and deeply moving, they'll say it, and immediately after, they'll say, can I get a witness? And what that preacher in that moment is asking you to do is simply bear witness to the truth of what they're saying. Simply sort of acknowledge, right, the veracity, right, of what it is that they just said. And so Pride in the Pews, when we began, we started with a storytelling project called Can I Get a Witness? And we collected 66 Black LGBTQ plus Christian stories. 66. And for the Bible scholars here, you probably know why we chose 66. And that's because there are 66 books in the Christian canonical text. And we did that intentionally, Dean Pierce. We wanted to articulate that in the same way that we see this text as sacred, we should see the stories of queer and trans people as sacred too. They have something to teach us, not just about how we relate to and with one another, but also how we relate to God. And so I enter this question by first naming that we need to expand our definition of what is sacred. Right? And when we start there, we are able to enter into a more capacious conversation. Right? Because if the stories of queer and trans people are sacred, then it means that what you learn from them has to be brought to your interpretation of the text. Right? And so for me, I recognize that the text is inescapable. In every church that we train, with every Black skeptical pastor that I'm in conversation with, the text inevitably comes up. And so here's what we did, Dean Pierce, organizationally. We hosted an event at Spelman College, and we conducted an interesting experiment. there are about 6 texts that are often used against LGBTQ plus communities. And they call those texts colloquially the clobber passages. And often when you hear someone refuting LGBTQ plus communities or even the humanity of LGBTQ plus people, these are usually the texts that they would go to. And so I came up with this compelling and interesting idea of getting 6 different preachers to preach these texts in affirming ways. And in so doing, we were able to have a master class on what it means to offer up a new exegetical framing for texts that are supposedly so familiar to us. And Dean Pierce, can I tell you a couple of?
Yes.
Yes, all right. And so I'm just making myself at home. Is that all right?
Be right at home, right at home.
And so one of the texts that came to light was the oft-told Sodom and Gomorrah text. And that text sort of centers a man by the name of Lot. And Lot had company, and it happened to be an angel. And the townsmen decided to approach Lot and said, "Hey, Lot, we want that angel so that we might be able to have our way with it." And Lot said, "No, I won't give you the angel. Instead, I'll give you my daughter." And so what do you do with this text that has been weaponized against LGBTQ plus people? And so one of those preachers decided to get up, and the title of the sermon was, "Our Girls Are Not Up for Grabs." And she wanted to underscore the ways in which we would legitimize violence against women and girls, all in service of maintaining fidelity to homophobia. And so as we began to think about what we do with these texts, that's a way that you reimagine it. It calls us and draws us, right, our interpretive tools, to think about the person who is most at risk in that text, whose experiences and stories have been rendered invaluable and or invisible. And so that's one way we do it. We actually tackle those texts head on and begin to reimagine them. So we were able to do that at Spelman College, which was really incredible. But then there's also, Dean Pierce, texts that call us into radical reimagination that we don't always think about when we talk about LGBTQ plus inclusion. One of my favorite stories is the story of the woman with the issue of blood. I often say, and I'm a Black Baptist preacher, so this is what I do. I often say we only shout over the first miracle. And that first miracle is the woman being healed. But the second miracle, Dean Pierce, is the woman being called daughter. Ooh, that feels good to me. Right? And here is why that's so powerful. Because in healing this woman, Jesus was offering a social critique of the ways in which systems of oppression, caste systems, which deem some people as on the inside, other people on the outside, as not being a part of the ministry or life of Jesus. And so by healing this woman, he was actually critiquing a system that left her suffering in silence. And so I not only wrestle with the texts that sort of have been interpreted in ways that delegitimize my humanity, but I look at other texts that call us to see the other as connected to our lived experience in our humanity. And so I'm interested in shared humanity, shared experiences that call us into different perspectives. And often, Scripture shows us that those different perspectives came from those who were dispossessed and left behind in society. And so if we map that onto the way that we move through the world today, it means that we should look at those who are most marginalized, most oppressed, and ask what they have to tell us, what they have to teach us, how we might learn from them. And the beautiful thing that Jesus shows us is that you don't actually need to believe what I believe to teach me. You don't have to walk the way that I walk to blow my mind theologically. And in fact, Dean Pierce, when I was at Divinity School, it wasn't the astute and powerful Christians who told me more about my faith. It was my Buddhist brother. It was my Muslim colleague who said, here are the theological paradigms that we operate within, and I want to share those with you. And in so doing, they invited me to re-examine my own faith, not ask me to give it up, not to convert me, but to invite me into a more expansive way of thinking about the divine.
I love this idea of expansiveness, this deep interfaith dialogue that happens in places much like this, and I'm sure at Harvard as well. Some great colleagues there. I want to pause for a moment to go back to, as you're talking about these texts, one theologian calls some of these texts of terror, right? Yes. And the reason I want to pause is because there is a lot of pain and hurt that doesn't often get articulated about the ways in which religion broadly, but in this particular instance, since we're talking about Christianity in particular, has been so wounding to LGBTQIA plus folk that leaving the faith, or perhaps leaving an individual church or a denomination or whatever, but that leaving may be necessary for the preservation of their soul. And so you're articulating this beautiful liberatory vision of possibility, but I'm wondering if we pause for a moment to kind of sit with the pain and the loss and the grief of so many who haven't found a way or a space or a person or a pastor or a priest or whomever with whom they could be their full selves, and so their decision to then leave that space. Do you feel called to invite folks back? Are you comfortable with the fact that people leave? How do you sit with that as it comes to you, both from your own experience, but I'm sure from the experiences that so many others have shared with you?
Yes, and so I want to harken back to the 66 stories that we collected, and it wasn't just a storytelling project, it was also research. And what we found when we hired qualified, qualitative researchers to help us dig through that data is that there were themes that emerged. And that was the vast majority of participants that we spoke to suffered from suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, social isolation. And that showed itself when I spoke to a Black trans man from Florida who said when he came out to his family, his mom said, "I wish I never had you." There were stories about queer folk, a Black woman in particular from Ohio, who said, "I never thought that I could be my full self, and so I had to leave. But when I left, my family told me to never come back." And so for that reason, I am not an evangelist for coming back to the Black church, because I believe that you can be a part of the Black church without attending a Black church. Because the church is not about the place or the building, it's about the values that are expressed and embodied among those who attend it. And so for me, I'm really, really interested in saying your lived experience is valuable and is sacred. And if for your own safety, you decide that you have to leave, that is a sacred choice and a sacred decision. And the same God that was with you in that church will be with you out in the wilderness. And so you have permission to do what you need to do to find your way back to God. And I like to be clear that folk may leave the church, but as they often express to me, they never leave God.
I'm so struck by this idea that a place that understands itself as a haven, as a sanctuary. We even deliberately use that word, as a hospital for the sick, right? That's the kind of language that we use, as a place for whosoever will, has unfortunately also been the site of so much harm. And I say that because it is beyond just the parameters of the individual church or religious community, but with legal implications, right? With all kinds of sort of public policy. So before we go into Q&A, I really have to sit with the idea of the kind of work that you do, the advocacy work that you do, and its reach beyond just our spaces of worship and our houses of worship and religious communities, but into how do we understand, how do we deal with states, including this one in which we are currently sitting, with anti-trans legislation, with anti-queer legislation of all varieties, anti-woman legislation, you name it. What is your response as a person of faith, rooted and grounded in your faith, to the ways in which these anti-human rights policies show up? And do you see people of faith having a role to play in those political, legal, policy struggles that so impact so many people?
Indisputably. As a Christian, when the book, the good book, as my grandmother would call it, is implicated, leveraged, and weaponized against queer and trans people, other Christians who see that as a distortion of their faith have a moral and spiritual responsibility to speak out. Whenever scripture is being used in the state legislature to condone the sort of criminalization of queer and trans people, it is people of faith who have a responsibility to call that out intentionally, unequivocally, unapologetically. It is our duty and responsibility to speak when this is happening. I often like to think of Jesus when, in fact, he stumbled upon this woman who was about to be stoned. And Jesus stepped into the middle of that crowd and said, if you want to get to her, you have to get through me first. And so part of the question that I have is, for those of us who want to follow the ministry of Jesus, why is it that we are intent on being stone throwers instead of being stone catchers? And so for me, I think we have a moral responsibility and duty to be stone catchers. To say, I may not be the one that your ire is directed at, but I recognize that I share kinship with those who are being oppressed, and therefore, when you hurt them, you hurt me. And so I do think that we have an unequivocal responsibility to speak out and speak up, and to do so with conviction, with power, clarity, and strategy.
And the difficulty of doing so when you share the language, you share the nomenclature, you share the sacred texts with those who may have an opposing point of view at the same time. Okay, all right. Let me just drop that nugget there. And then so we'd like to just take a little bit of time to open up for at least a couple of questions from the audience. And we're asking you to speak into the mic because this is being recorded, so we just want to be able to hear your question. This is Jeopardy! Please form a question in the form of a question. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for this really convicting and clarifying conversation. My question for you is, how do you encourage churches and communities where, as Dean Pierce just mentioned, they use the same text and they read things differently? And have you had a lot of experiences in engaging conversations, not confronting, but conversations, and what are some of the positive outcomes that you've experienced by way of this kind of dialogue? Because, I mean, we're doing this Dialogue Vanderbilt, so, and I've been here at Vanderbilt Divinity School as a faculty for the last 18 years, but I come from more of the centrist kind of congregations, but, like, I really appreciated what you had to say. So what are some of your experiences and proposals for engaging in dialogues with congregations that are They may not share your viewpoint right now, but they're interested in listening what others have to say about these texts of terror.
So first and foremost, it's important to note that currently 0 out of 8 historically black Christian traditions affirm LGBTQ plus communities. 0 out of 8. The National Baptist Convention, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, the AME Church, and so on, none of which have an affirmative stance of LGBTQ plus communities. And so here I am, with pride in the pews, saying I want to engage the black church around this issue. And so that means the vast majority of my interlocutors are folk who disagree with me. Folk who are not aligned theologically. And so the work that we have to do is think about what it means to have our organization be an embodied invitation to critical examination of the text that we both hold so dear. And one of the best ways that I've been able to do that is through storytelling. The Bible says that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, which means that there's power in the sharing of our stories. And when we engage trainings, it is through the stories that we're able to actually make headway. It's through the stories that we're actually able to create community and foster connection. I want to give a quick story and share this. And you asked about positive outcomes, and I do think this is one of them. And so we partnered with a black church on the south side of Chicago that is currently led by the former president of the National Baptist Convention. Let that sink in. Our offices are, in fact, in this church. And we decided to host an event for World AIDS Day, right, where we honored the lives of LGBTQ plus folk who perished from HIV and who are still living with HIV. And we decided to sort of invite the congregation into that conversation. And in so doing, after a couple Sundays after, the pastor called me and said, "Hey, Don, do you have a second?" I said, "I do." He says, "I want to tell you something. There's a head of the deacon board at my church who called me to the church one Sunday and said, Stephen Thurston, I need to talk with you." And he says, "Okay." He says, "You know, you had that HIV World AIDS Day celebration at the church." He says, "Yeah." And he was gearing up. He was ready. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you because I have a nephew who does hair. He's gay. He has his own shop. And we have been estranged for more than 10 years. I want to take you somewhere. Hop in the car with me." He drove this pastor to that beauty shop. And he says, "I want to introduce you to my nephew. It is because of the work that you did in this congregation, in this space, that we are now reconciled. That we can now once again be in relationship." And so as I think about the positive outcomes, it's stories like these that remind me that there's power in simply building relationship and connection. There is power in leveraging storytelling as a tool of resistance. And the beauty of it is, I don't have to convince you or convert you to my lived experience. All you have to do is read it as a sacred text, asking what might I be able to learn.
Sorry. Hi, thank you so much for everything that you've been saying. I wrote it all down because I wanted to make sure I got everything. It's clear that you have an admiration and appreciation for the Holy Bible. I want to hear a little more about your views on this Christian notion of absolute truth, and if you think the Christian Bible is absolute truth, and how do you kind of reconcile the truth of personal experiences that can contradict the Holy Bible?
Oh, that's a Divinity School question.
Come join us.
And so I think one of the things that I like to do is hold space for the Bible to contradict itself. And it is from that premise that I engage ideas of truth. And so for me, there are particular passages in the Bible that I subscribe to, right? This idea of the imago Dei. We are, in fact, the image of God. The idea that, in fact, we are supposed to lower the man down to Jesus if he can't get there himself. These are sort of broad principles and ideas that I agree with. And I acknowledge that I am a part of a spiritual tradition that often refuted theologies which questioned our humanity. And so that spiritual tradition compels me to reject biblical passages and interpretations which suggest that God does not love me as I am. And so that doesn't mean that you won't find passages in the scripture that would endorse me being enslaved or my ancestors being beaten. But it does mean that there is a sort of theological ethic that I have to fundamentally reject those ideas in ways that are in service of what I believe to be liberation, freedom, connection with the divine, in capacious, broad ways. The Bible says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And so in loving, right, God with all of me, it means that I have to acknowledge that on its face, the Bible has inherent contradictions that we have to reckon with. And just like my ancestors who refused to be dehumanized by problematic interpretations of Scripture, I take on that same disposition to refuse to subscribe to those as well.
Hi, I have a question. So for a little bit of context, I grew up in the church, and I realized I was queer in high school and kind of went through that process that you talked about of deconstructing and reconstructing my faith. I'm a little bit curious about, so I attend a church in Nashville that is queer affirming. It's a Methodist church, so it's in that kind of weird, we don't really know what's happening right now, but, and I love what you said about the Black church being about liberation from oppression. So I'm wondering about, I'm in a church where everyone is affirmed regardless of their race, sexuality, abled or disabled, but because of the location that it's in and the style of church, it's a very kind of high church, we sing in Latin sometimes, that most of the congregation is predominantly white. So I was just wondering what advice you have for people who are in predominantly white spaces who are trying to support diversity and trying to support liberation for our siblings.
One, thank you for your question and your story. It's much appreciated. My immediate response is story. Location matters. Me naming and noting that I find my theological underpinning, rooting, grounding at the place of the Black church is important to name, because it's from that place that I'm able to actually have historical context, right, for the faith that I inherited. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is think about your faith context, right, and say, where was the United Methodist Church during the Jim Crow era? Where was the United Methodist Church during the Holocaust? Where was the United Methodist Church during the women's rights movement and all of its phases and iterations? And when you start asking yourself those questions about your own history, you will find figures who likely stood toe-to-toe. They're less known, less visible, but they're there. And introducing that legacy and that thread into the conversation, I think, can prompt advocacy, reflection, and refute the notion and idea that this isn't what we do. We haven't done this before. We don't know how to speak to this from the place of our tradition. I guarantee you that when you look back in your own history, you will not only find names of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves, but you will also find individuals who quietly yet fiercely, honestly and authentically live into the truth of who they are. And inviting those stories to the forefront, holding space for that sacredness, I think can create a pathway for white congregations or congregations of any kind, wedded to a particular lived experience or community tie, to be able to say, there's an entry point for us in this fight for justice and liberation. And it's not the place of the Black church. It's not your story. It's not your experience. But you do have a place. It's a matter of locating it within your own tradition. Those stories lie there. We might have to dig a little bit to find it, though.
So I always have the privilege of asking the final question. So I ask the same opening question and the same final question. And my question is this. In a broken and fractured world where we are dealing with war and rumors of war, where we feel so divided around so many different things, where people really feel discouraged, where it's not anything for us to open up our phone and read on Twitter about a young trans youth who has been killed. In spite of all of that, what gives you hope? What gives you hope to continue to do the work that you do, to continue to speak, to continue to preach, to continue to every day walk in this calling? What gives you hope?
I'd like to answer that question with two stories. One of them is, I shared with you all about the World AIDS Day commemoration that we did at this Black church on the south side of Chicago. And there was this elderly woman, she's 89, if I'm not mistaken, 89 years old. After the service, we had a health fair. And I was walking around with the senior pastor, greeting everyone who decided to come for the health fair. And this 80-year-old Black woman is on her walker, and she's making her way to us. And she says, "Hey, look." And she opens up her purse, and she shows me that she has a handful of condoms that she's bringing back to the nursing home. Dean Pierce, this gives me hope. Right? This is a funny and cheeky and lighthearted story. And this was a woman who was willing to rid herself of notions of sexual purity, who was willing to reimagine her theology, to own her own sexual liberation, and to do so within her home church at 89. I go to the same church as this woman. This gives me hope, knowing and recognizing that when you extend the invitation, both young and old alike will answer that call to create a more just and inclusive world. So I told you there were two stories. That's one. The second story is this, and I find it hilarious, and I hope that you will too. I was having a training at a church in Chicago, and there was this elderly gentleman, probably in his late 60s, early 70s. He had sat through the whole training without saying a word, and I had assumed that he was receiving this information with some level of disdain or maybe resistance, which I was generally accustomed to. And toward the tail end of that training, he stopped and said, "I have a question." And I said, "I can't wait for this. I wonder what this question will be." He's been quiet the whole time. And he says, "I just want to know. I just need you to tell me, what is a bear?" I mean, I'm mystified and perplexed and confounded. And I couldn't believe that he understood this insider terminology within the LGBTQ plus community of what a bear is. And a bear, for those of you who are wondering, what is a bear? Where can I find one? A bear is someone within the LGBTQ plus community, particularly men, who are burly and hairy and big in stature. Right? And he asked that question boldly and loudly and said, I just want to know what a bear is. And I thought it was hilarious and funny. And in that moment, I recognized that it likely took incredible courage and strength to ask in front of his peers and his colleagues whom he respects and trusts the question of, what is a bear? And it's funny and it's cheeky and it's silly and it's wild, right? And this was someone who likely came in terrified of what he would encounter. Concerned perhaps that he would be chastised or condemned because of the way that he engaged this conversation. But in creating space, through storytelling, through the expression of our shared humanity, he took that leap of faith and said, there's an aspect of your humanity that I do not understand, and I'm eager to learn. Dean Pierce, the 89-year-old woman who's stuffing condoms in her bag, and the elderly deacon who wants to know what a bear is, those two, they give me hope.
Thank you so much, Reverend Don Abram. So, our aim with these conversations is to better understand the diverse faith lenses that exist not only on this campus, but the world. And through this intersection of faith and the pressing issues that matter to us all, we hope to come to a better understanding not only of new perspectives, but of ourselves and each other as human beings. I hope you continue these conversations with me, and my special thanks for the wonderful stories, insight, and passion. I will not ever look at a nursing home, I think, again, the same. Thank you so much for being our guests. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and those of you online, thank you.
That's right. Always love that.